Yes, I was born and educated in UK and went to college there. And my very first job out of college was I was recruited as a geologist for BP. And at that time, BP was working around the world, and the very first place they sent me to was Alaska. So I came here in 1960 and was more or less here until the earthquake in '64. And then they sent me around the world a few times and came back in '75, and I've been here ever since. It was very basic work. First of all, there were no maps in northern Alaska at that time. There were some aerial photographs, but they were oblique, and consequently, they were very distorted, and they were better than nothing, but only a little bit, you know. So basically, we had to make our own topographical maps as we went along, mapping the rocks, which sort of made it a slow process. But nobody had done it before, so you didn't have any options but to sort of work from first principles up. And there were no geological maps. The Geological Survey was starting to work up there at the same time that we were in the field. So we were working concurrently, sort of thing. So it was very, very basic geology, from scratch, basically. And as time went on, so your knowledge grew, and so, you know, you started to work out the theoretical potential of the area you're working in. The first survey they had in Alaska was, I think, in 1959. And then they worked the Gulf of Alaska area and spent the whole summer working, mapping the geology. In 1960, when I came, we started off in the Kuskokwim area, and from 1st of May till the 1st of July, we worked there, mapping again, just basic mapping. And on the 1st of July, we flew up to the North Slope and worked until the snow came in mid-September. And this went on year after year until the knowledge base was enough to say that basin's no good, this one is, sort of thing. Let's concentrate on this one. And that's the process that happened. I think there were two main reasons. First of all, BP wanted, because they had a lot of oil, they had all the Iranian, Persian oil at that time, they wanted desperately to market petroleum in the United States. And they realized quite early on, when they made sort of tentative footsteps towards that goal, that it wasn't going to work unless they had indigenous American oil. And so they determined that, all right, let's see what the opportunities are. Well, of course, in the lower 48, people had been drilling for oil for 100 years or so. So it was not competitive to expect to go in there and make a killing. So they looked at Alaska, which in those days, in the late 50s, was just coming into the petroleum scene because some of the Cook Inlet discoveries had been made in 57, 58, something like that. So that was the first reason they wanted to be in the States, and they decided on Alaska as the goal for enabling them to set up this bigger marketing project, which they were really keen on, i.e. selling petroleum. And then when this thought process was going on, one of the BP senior exploration people was on an SAS airplane which had just started flying over the pole from Oslo or somewhere like that to Anchorage. And he happened to be on this flight coming to Anchorage, or perhaps he was going on somewhere else, I'm not sure. But at any rate, he looked out the window and he looked down, and it was a beautiful, clear day, and there were the Brooks Range, and in front of the Brooks Range he saw all the foothills, and he said, my God, he said, that's exactly the same as the Zagros Mountains in Persia, where BP owns all the oil. We've got to look at this. And so he came and added his 2 cents to the game plan, and so Alaska became the favored place to look. We always had something like a de Havilland Beaver or a Piper Cub or something like that, a fixed wing. And that would be the main way that petroleum, i.e. Aviation gas, was put into dumps on the North Slope or wherever we were working. usually on a lake. The fixed wing would be on floats, and it would fly in a barrel at a time and roll them out and put them on the shoreline, you know. And because the geological parties always had a helicopter. That was our main two means of transportation, your 2 feet and the helicopter. The helicopter would take you where you had to work, and then you'd be on your own sort of thing, walking. So you were sort of, to a large degree, compared with today, at the mercy of the weather and so on. And this is especially not just petroleum, not aviation gas, which you could stockpile, but food you couldn't. So the food came in once a week to Umiat, which had a gravel airstrip, and you'd send a little airplane in to fetch it to your camp, wherever it was. And if it didn't come to Umiat, well, you ran out of food, you know. But it didn't turn out to be a problem, because you could always go fishing and you could catch so many fish that you had enough to eat. You didn't have to worry about it. We went to Canada and did the Arctic Islands. So I spent two seasons doing the same thing in the Arctic Islands of Canada. Different geology, but very similar conditions. Then I spent a year in Libya until Colonel Gaddafi came along and kicked us out of Libya. A couple of years in Australia, working in Papua New Guinea. A period in Kuwait. 2 years in Colombia, South America, working in the high Andes. And then back to Alaska. We came back in 1975. So when I left, the sort of search for Prudhoe Bay we were moving towards that, because what happened was, after the fieldwork turned up positive indications of oil and gas accumulation. But what we did was what had basically been done in Persia, in Iran, but also what the geology told us, i.e. look at the folds in the foothills first, where you had trapping mechanisms, so that if there were reservoir rocks, which we knew there were from the outcrops on the surface some places, and source rocks, then that's a good place to look. So the first wells were drilled in 1963, I think, something like that, by BP. And that was, it told us that our geological prognosis was okay from the surface rocks. Now we had 10,000 feet of subsurface information. But it told us that basically, if we wanted to find accumulations of oil and gas, we had to move northwards. And so subsequently BP drilled, I don't know how many it was now, 3 or 4 other wells after the first one. And each time, and before the last one, perhaps it was the 5th one, they found oil. They moved northwards the whole time. They found oil in the Saguenay-Nooktock River Delta, which was mainly in Lisbon limestone, which is a very tight formation. And although it was full of oil, it wouldn't test very profusely at all. And at that time, BP had spent a lot of money, and for those days, they were leading the pack. And they said, oh gosh, you know, we were wrong. And so they didn't quit. They kept all their leases, but they decided no more exploration for them. They were going to take a breather. Now, in the meantime, of course, the first lease sale had taken place, the big one, and BP had enough knowledge then and had recognized the Prudhoe Bay structure from seismic work. There's no rocks on the surface at that location. It's all tundra, flat. So they knew the Prudhoe Bay structure was there, and they bid over the whole structure. And they think they put more or less uniform bids everywhere on the big structure. And much to their shock and dismay, when the results were announced, they found that ARCO had put higher bids than them only on the crest of the structure. And they didn't think ARCO had any knowledge of the Prudhoe Bay structure at all. That's a long story which we won't get into because it's controversial, but nevertheless, that was the situation. And of course, ARCO being on top of this structure, guessing or knowing some of the results from the early wells that BP had drilled the discovery well. And the story goes, and I wasn't present when this happened, but the story goes they drilled the Discovery well on the crest of Pruta Bay. And the first thing they did, they got a high-powered team and they flew to London to persuade BP to sell them all their leases. And I think if they'd sent a lone geologist, it might have worked. But because they sent VPs and goodness knows who else, it didn't. And BP smelled a rat and realized that they'd made some significant finds in the Discovery well. So that was the beginning of the development of Pruta Bay. Yeah. And of course, it so happened that on the crest of the structure, Arco had most of the gas. On the flanks, BP had most of the oil. Well, I'm not sure if I can remember them all now, but we were looking, we left the Pruta Bay area to the development geologists, which is a very specialized job involving not just, mainly detailed analysis of the rock cores that have been taken in development wells and so on and so forth. So we just said, all right, well, let's see, when now we know there's a lot of oil on the North Slope, let's look elsewhere. And we found the Nyakuk field just offshore, a few miles offshore, for example, and drilled all sorts of wells on the North Slope. I can't remember all their names now. Endicott, yes, the Mukluk well. Well, the Mukluk well was a very good theoretical prospect. It was offshore, which made it expensive. But from our geological knowledge, it looked to be to have everything you look for at that location. It had source rocks, it had reservoir rocks. We thought from geophysics it had a structure there, and therefore, although it was the most expensive well ever drilled at that time, I think, it was worth it. When it was drilled, it was a technical success and a geological failure, because basically whatever oil had been in the reservoir, and it had been full at one stage, had leaked out through faulting, so it was all gone. So it was basically a dry hole. I think I probably was, yes, because by that time we had the exploration people were looking after permitting, environmental work, and the geological stuff, obviously. Permitting became almost more important than the exploration. The exploration by this time it wasn't easy, and obviously it wasn't always successful, but it was something that you had in your brain day and night and forever, sort of thing, whereas permitting was a new phenomenon, and not a very nice one either. You had to work with multiple agencies, especially the Corps of Engineers, the feds, because you were inevitably working on wetlands and so on, and they were in charge of that. And obviously most of the leases were state leases. You were working with the state. And it was always a battle of who was leading who. And I always argued, and I used to do it with the state people, because you got to know them pretty well, you know, that in fact we were leading and they were following. And we, you might say rather naively, were telling them not only exactly what we were doing, which we probably had to by law, but we were telling them all the new things we were doing to improve protection of the environment, and so on and so forth. And so the next time you went to them, those things that you'd suggested were a good idea, they had made mandatory. So they were piggybacking on us, not us piggybacking on them at all. You know, we were the leaders, they were the followers. However, and sometimes they got obstreperous too. They made it very, very difficult. So it was a sort of human relations endeavor, as much as knowing the sort of intricacies of the laws and the regulations and the geology and so on. If you couldn't work with them and come away still talking to them after 2 hours of disagreement, you know, it was no good. You may as well throw in a towel and give up, because they'd never give you your permits any longer. So you had to be pretty reasonable about things. Well, I remember, well, the Endicott was difficult because we had a causeway going out to a gravel island and so on, or that was the plan. And of course we put these bridges on the causeway so that the Arctic cisco fish, which migrate along the north coast of Alaska in the summertime, didn't have to go make a detour and go around. So they went through, which added, you know, a few tens of millions of dollars to it probably, I don't know, I've forgotten now. But the one thing I remember about that, and it took a long time, don't ask me how long, years, was it came about that it was all going to be decided by the Corps of Engineers. We'd more or less got the state sorted out. And I went to Washington, D.C., to the Pentagon, and with a chap by the name of Mark Schneider, who worked in the office there. And while we were driving to the Pentagon for this make or break meeting, we came to a roundabout, and Mark's car that we were driving got sidetracked by a truck. And the truck belonged to some sort of engineer because it was full of nuts and bolts. And these just came out like a rainstorm, a hailstorm, you know, all over the road. And I said to Mark, I said, look, Mark, you stay here and sort this out, and I'll catch it, flag down a taxi and go to the Pentagon, which I did. Well, about an hour into the meeting with the Corps, which wasn't going too well, Mark came in, and the colonel, or whoever it was, I've forgotten now, he said, look, he said, we're not comfortable with this at all. You've explained all your situation and so on, but now we're concerned about the polar bears. At which time Mark, who was a lawyer, just exploded. I mean, he lost his cool, he really did. He stood up and he showed his fists at him. He said, after all this time and you're talking about the polar bears, we've never heard about polar bears until now. And he really lit into them, you know. And anyway, they backed down. And a week later they said, all right, we'll give you the permit. And that was it. So it had its sort of highlights and so on. I became involved with all the politics, the politics because of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the D2 Lands Bill. And that was going to decide, you know, the sort of future acreage which would be available for oil and gas development. And Senator Stevens was around at that time, and so I did a lot of work with him trying to get a logical solution to this controversy of what land should be locked up and what should be open. I was going back to more and more to Washington, D.C. And in a way it was a public relations thing because all the sort of big national, some of the natives were for it and some were against it. The national TV things like Nova, and there was I can't remember the title of it now, a program called 48 Hours or something like that, and PBS, and they all came up here and they wanted to have both sides, you know, and so there was a lot of that sort of stuff involved. Anyway, that got me into the after the D2 lands was sorted out, that got into the politics of the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and how that was going to be opened up, because according to the law it could be at the discretion of the Secretary of the Interior. And that's when I more or less was working full-time in DC. And my job was just to go to the players and the decision makers in the House and the Senate and try and educate them on the details of what would be involved if there was any development, exploration and development on the coastal plain. And it was an uphill battle, it really was. But interestingly, about at that time, they didn't know what to do with me in BP, because here I was supposed to be in charge of exploration. There wasn't any exploration going on, and I was spending all my time in DC. So they said, all right, we're going to call you an executive consultant or something like that, and you can go and do what you like, more or less. They didn't say that, but the reality was, I think I testified in front of various committees of Congress, House and Senate, something like 55 times. And I think of those 55, only once did BP ask me what I was going to say or what my testimony was going to be. They left me to it, Unfortunately, I didn't sort of create too many furores, sort of thing. Well, I would like to think so, yes. It was progressing, there's no doubt about that. And in fact, it was an interesting political exercise because the fight took, whatever it was, overall about 20 years. And yet during that time, there were many, many votes in committees and so on and so forth. I can't remember, I don't know how many. But whatever it was, Energy Committee or whatever, we won, the pro-Anwar group won every vote except one. And the only one we lost was one that Senator Murkowski called. He was chairman of the committee. And we said, no, don't call that. He said, well, we haven't had a vote for a year or something. I want to know where things stand. We know where things stand. Anyway, he had the vote and he lost. But that was the only time. So we were making slow progress, inching forward, So one could argue, I could argue, I think that yes, we probably would have succeeded but for the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Well, I've known ever since my first geological forays into Alaska that it's an oil and gas state, a mineral state, forestry state. It's a natural resource state. Alaska, and okay, we've got visitors and tourists and so on top of that in the summertime. But without the natural resources, Alaska's population would, I think, dwindle until it became almost unsupportable. So if Alaska looks after those resources and persuades the powers that be that they can be developed in a safe and rational and environmentally acceptable fashion, Alaska will continue to prosper for many, many generations. But without that, until we get sort of nuclear power in everybody's backyard or energy forms of that nature, Alaska can't supply energy, then it's on the outs because there are not enough bird watchers to keep it going. Oh boy, that's a hard one. It was all great fun, so picking out one special thing from another is quite difficult for me. I did like being challenged, especially when it came to permitting and so on, and working with people who were really not on your side and making them see sense, sort of thing. And to a degree, that was true in Washington, D.C., too. You were always trying to persuade people to do something that their inclination was not to do. But I worked with a lot of good people. I mean, not just outside of the oil industry, but in the oil industry too. And some of them, there are different facets in the oil industry, and the general public doesn't realize this. I mean, somebody who's an expert at producing oil from an oil field can hardly talk the language of a geologist who's trying to find new oil. They're in different worlds, and you have to get on because you rely on each other all the time. And that was one of the things which I always sort of thought was rather great. Well, as you may know from something I said recently, I think the worst scam that the country has ever seen is this global warming thing. Sure, there's climate change. There's been climate change for the last 5 billion years, for heaven's sake. So what's different about this time now? It's certainly not CO2, because CO2 levels in geological time have been 10 times higher than they've been today. And the world has managed that without any problems, without man being here to create the chaos that man is capable of creating. And until there's some logic with regard to so-called man-made CO2 and logic with regard to what is natural climate change, I think we're heading in the wrong direction, quite frankly. And that saddens me because it takes trillions of dollars away from things where it would be better spent to the benefit of everybody around the world.